My name is Martin C. I'm a member of the working poor in Singapore. I live in 2 3-room HDB flats all my life. I also invited PM Lee to live in my house once over Facebook. Of course, he didn't reply. Today, I come wearing the PAP hat. All right, the PAP's government's 3 favorite arguments against any criticisms of poverty in Singapore is this. Number 1, there is no starving poor in Singapore. People here have 3 meals a day. Cardboard collecting and table cleaning amas are doing it to exercise and to kill time. Number 2, a more unequal society is not necessarily a bad thing. Attracting more billionaires into Singapore will create more jobs, and wealth will trickle down to all. 3, democracy and political rights will not put food on the table. So how would the panel respond to these 3 often cited arguments?
Thank you, Martin.
Okay.
Yes, any else?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
My name is Hani. I'm from
sorry,
Alert.
hang on a minute. I think we have to ask, we have to address Martin's one, and then we come to you. How about that? Okay.
I think, those are arguments we hear all the time. There's no starving poor in Singapore. There's not, but there are people who don't. There are many families who don't get enough of the proper nutrition. You can fill your stomach with all kinds of junk food that's not good for you. But for nutritious meals, 3 nutritious meals a day for a family of 4, unless you're earning the living wage, $500 per capita, I challenge you to try and put on nutritious meals for yourself and your kids. So either you are not going to have nutritious meals, and we've seen it before, father eats bread out of a packet so his kids can have the meat and veggies and rice, or vice versa. Okay, so that's myth number 1. Myth number 2 is the amas like to do this for exercise, right? There will always be individual people who like to do that kind of thing for exercise in any society, but for so many people to have to do it, you know what I would do? I would start a fitness gym. The teachers here to push cardboard, right? It must be really popular. I do not believe that for a second. And if you look at the hard economics of the elderly poor, and you look at its roots, this is what you see at the labor market, right? You see them previous to the cleaners, previous to the PEP, in which they provide at least a minimum wage for cleaners, which is 2 years ago. These people were earning $600, $700 a month. You can be 70 years old. You have 1 day off, as I mentioned, every 2 weeks. What is the reason for that? The reason is that all the cleaning is outsourced to cleaning companies who largely employ cheap foreign workers from China, East Malaysia. I even met some kadazans in my local coffee shop, believe it or not. And these people are willing to work for those wages because those wages, if they save some, they are actually reasonably well off at home. So we are pitting the rural poor in our neighborhood against our uncles and aunties on the labor market, and that is why they have to sell their labor under those conditions. So I challenge any PAP MP to say that there is no problem, and these people are doing it out of exercise needs.
Okay. Is that all? Yeah? Before I go to Hani, I think, you'd like to say something? Yes?
I was just going to say, I echo Lam Keong's point about that the fact that the nutrition is very poor, and that, in the families that I've met, there are a lot of trade-offs that people make within the family sort of dietary and food intake, meaning, parents going a little bit hungrier so that kids can eat. And the empty calories thing, I think, is a big thing. So, a lot of sodas and sweet drinks, as a way to sort of fill calories. And although a lot of these families are on financial assistance schemes in schools, which in theory give money for buying food in school canteens, a lot of times that is not enough for the kids. So they come home still quite hungry. So they get, I think, I've heard different figures. They get, either $2 a day or $1.50. And if they have remedial classes, there's no additional, yeah. And so often they're still very hungry, and these are growing children, right? So they still are quite hungry, and the way to fill it, of course, is rice. When rice or bread and the sodas and all that, and they definitely don't have adequate things like they don't have adequate protein, for example, right? So just yesterday, actually, I met a family where the mom was saying that like fish and prawns, this is like a once a month kind of thing, yeah. Again, I think it's important to step back and look at our city as a whole, right? And to think about, well, okay, if we are a really wealthy city and that's what we take pride in, how is this acceptable? How is it, even if people are not dying on the streets, how is this acceptable, right? The point you made about wealth being, and it's not your point, I know, but wealth trickle down. I was hoping one of you would say more about that, because I think that it's important, where's the empirical evidence for this, right? Democracy will not put food on the table. I think earlier Donald had mentioned, that we place closer to the East Asian countries, at least in the 90s, in terms of our welfare spending, as and welfare principles. But what has happened in places like Taiwan and in South Korea has been an expansion, and the expansion has come about as a result of political pressure. Yeah, so that is absolutely important to shifting the kind of welfare regime a country has, is politics and political pressure, and people having the a voice, yeah, and having the mechanisms for articulating what it is they want, their representatives in government to do for them. Yeah.
Donald, trickle down.
Yeah, the whole trickle-down idea has been discredited. So, Martin, you don't do a good enough job representing or pretending to be the government. They've moved on also to more sophisticated arguments. But just on trickle-down, yeah, there's no evidence. Lam Keong's chart about how in the US, the top wage earners have done very well, have kept pace with GDP growth, but even middle income earners have not kept pace with GDP growth. They've fallen. There's a huge gap between GDP growth and what high wage earners incomes are increasing at with what middle income earners are getting. So in the US, it's not just low wage stagnation, but also middle income stagnation, median wage stagnation. So the argument is less about trickle down, the argument. But if they were to argue that there is trickle down, and more billionaires will just create jobs well, it depends on what sorts of billionaires are we talking about, right? Who caused the crisis? Rich bankers or people on welfare? No, seriously. Who caused the great global financial crisis? Was it the corporate? Was it the malfeasance and the moral hazard of the rich? And the idea that if their bets went well, they would collect all the gains, but if their bets went bad, society, you'll be socialized by society and government will pick up the tab. Was it that kind of moral hazard that caused the global financial crisis? Or was it the kind of moral hazard that the government likes to talk about? If you give too much aid, if you give too much people will become lazy, they'll feed off the state, welfare expenditures will become unsustainably high. The global financial crisis, which I think should really be a catalyst for us to rethink a lot of these things, a lot of these assumptions, was entirely caused by the behaviors and the irresponsible actions of the rich, bankers primarily, really, and not the poor. So and yet who's the one paying the price of the financial crisis? It's all of us. It's the poor, right? Welfare expenditures have had to be cut. Fiscal austerity in the rich world meant who are the ones that meant that the ones who are most dependent on public services, on unemployment insurance, on public pensions, on public health care. Those are the ones who had to pay the price of the irresponsibility of those billionaires who were supposed to trickle down, whose income was supposed to trickle down. First, trickle down didn't happen. We all know that. Instead it was trickle up. It was the poor paying for. It was all of us paying for the idiocy and the mistakes of the rich.
Thank you. Yes.
Can I just add one final comment? I'd like to give a good example of democracy and food on the table, which is the universal healthcare systems of Hong Kong, Korea, and Taiwan. Okay, now Singapore, until MediShield Life just went into operation last November, did not have universal healthcare. Okay, we had good healthcare for everybody unless you're in the bottom 30%, and okay long-term care for everybody unless you're in the bottom 70%. Everywhere else in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Korea, they have put both good hospitalization and long-term care, affordable long-term care, and that is a direct result of democratic demand with the liberalization, democratization of those three political economies. Okay, so do you want universal health care? This is a bread and butter issue. It's not exactly the kitchen table, but it's a very important basic need. Universal health care and democracy in East Asia go hand in hand. And it's no coincidence that now, even though we have MediShield Life, we don't have any existing decent infrastructure for long-term healthcare in Singapore. None. Okay, we're still paying for dialysis through VWOs. Okay, this is serious stuff. Okay, the other point I'd like to touch on is the poverty line. Now you mentioned, we just had a debate, are the poor eating well, are they not eating well? This can easily be solved if you measure poverty properly. If you measure how much it costs to give not only enough calories a day, but sufficient nutrition a day, it can be measured, can it not? You can go to the market and buy these things and decide how much they cost. You can make them into baskets that would feed families of 4. You can index indices that make sure that your indices, your measurements of these, keep up with inflation of these items, which tend to be higher than the average inflation rate every year. You can do all these things. You do not have to have a single poverty line. That's a confusing conflation. They say, no such thing as a single poverty line because it's a stupid measure. Well, yes, of course, a single poverty line is a stupid measure, but proper poverty measures for different situations are not. They are the basis of rational policy, which we do not have, which they have insisted on not having. Okay, thank you.